in this third session of our expert lecture series organized by Department of English Alumni Association and as part of the MoU of Department of English, Saurashtra University, Rajkot, and Constantine the Philosopher University, Nitra, Slovakia. A very warm welcome. Last 2 days, we have had uh, the sessions that were really well studied, one probably with a depth uh, in case of waves, and yesterday it was on translation specific to Slovakian literature in English. Today, we have in series the third lecture, New Horizons of the Literary, exploring the intersections of literature and technology in contemporary culture. So, with a warm welcome, I also welcome the speaker today, Erik György, who is a postdoctoral assistant at the Department of English and American Studies at Constantine the Philosopher University in Nitra, Slovakia. His research explores the contemporary forms of storytelling, including electronic literature and print digital hybrids. He investigates the dynamic relationship between the print and electronic mediums, how these evolving forms reshape our understanding of narrative, and how they can be explored with a pedagogical purpose is to engage and inspire learners. His works also crosses into cultural and media studies. The presentation will explore the evolving landscape of digital literature, beginning with clear definitions of what constitutes digital literature and its various forms, such as interactive fiction, hypertext, crime fiction, and it will examine how traditional print literature intersects with new technological inventions that are reshaping storytelling and experience and offering immense, highly interactive and dynamic ways of engaging with text, including VR and AR. Additionally, the discussion will highlight the cultural implications of these shifts and consider how digital and hybrid literature impact both the consumption and the creation of stories in contemporary culture. I'm sure that it will be a meaningful a session for young minds who are more into this digital age, products of the digital age. I welcome you once again, Erik György, and uh, request you to begin with your talk.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Can you hear me? Is the sound all right?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, good. All right, give me a few seconds to set up the presentation. So I will ask you again whether you can see it clearly, the PowerPoint, I mean.
Yes.
All right, thank you. So, good afternoon to you. Good morning for some of the others. Thank you for the introduction one more time. And as you correctly highlighted, I will be talking about everything that I've been practically interested in the last 10 years. So it will be probably a lot of new information. I try to summarize the main points and focus on clear visual examples so that it's exactly highlighted what I want to say or what that specific form of literature is. So there will be lots of videos and visuals along the way. I structured the presentation so that it contains two parts. The first one will be just about electronic literature so that you have a background to what that means and the different forms that you just mentioned, twine, hypertext, interactive fiction. And the second part will be about the interactions of print literature with digital literature. It will be a bit shorter, again, mostly a summary of everything that I've been interested in, but with specific examples. So, right, I will try to reorganize my windows so that I can see you as well and the presentation. What I also wanted to mention is that since this is more of a talk, for now, if you have any questions, you can immediately just type it in the chat and I can address those later or along the way if I notice them. But probably after I've finished, we can talk about everything, either again by you putting those questions, those inquiries in the chat, or just directly addressing me. So feel free to ask about anything that you see. So to begin with, again, this is roughly 10 years ago that I started researching electronic literature. I started with more avant-garde forms in print literature that I was interested in. Practically any kind of experiment that was conducted, I found it interesting because I wanted to see what people can do with literature, with the written word. Some of those experiments or the movements you can see on this slide: futurism, Dada, surrealism, concrete poetry, sound poetry, lettrism, the Oulipo movement, or the Fluxus movement. If you are interested in any of these and also electronic literature, the companion to experimental literature that you can see on this slide is an excellent beginning. I found it very informative, and again, this is the way I got to electronic literature. It wasn't really because I was interested in digital literature that much. I just wanted to see all kinds of experiments with literature, and eventually I got to electronic literature, and since it was not that well understood and researched, I decided to focus mostly on that. So these would be the, again, starting points, and then from these I kind of got, let's say, I also got the idea from Virginia Woolf, just to mention a classic again. In one of her essays, she wrote about the hybrid forms that she saw in her times, how fiction was evolving and trying to capture the differences in thinking of people in her time. And she specifically mentioned that it's not always just the past that we can look at or have to look at. We can also just think about how fiction will, or in her case, poetry as well, will evolve and continue to change in order to be able to capture the changes in human thinking. And again, electronic literature is something like that. It is very attuned to thinking, to how thinking is nowadays. So with this, I got on that journey. I started focusing on electronic literature, and now I will get to explaining what that really is. There are countless ways to understand it. Sorry, I will have to shuffle these windows a lot. There's a lot of open windows on my computer. The most important definition that I will focus on today, and the most commonly referenced one, is actually in the middle of this slide by Alice Bell and her colleagues. It's the one that's the clearest, and it explains that this kind of fiction is actually written on and for the computer. So practically, the digital medium in which it is born is indispensable. It is essential for us to understand this, because this is not just, let's say, books that can be printed. It's fiction that is tied to that medium. It has components like, again, sound, animation, anything that can be done with digital devices. And if you separate that digital medium, that digital device, something would be lost. So the aesthetic or semiotic functions that are essential to the interpretation would be lost that way. I also usually insert this word "usually" in the middle of this definition, because it's technically incorrect to say that all of these different pieces can only be enjoyed on a computer screen or some kind of digital device. Some can be printed, but again, the digital medium is essential at least to its creation. So for instance, digital poems. I will talk about those different forms later, and probably it will be a bit more clear what I mean by this. But let's say if you use a computer program, a specific algorithm to generate a poem or reshuffle, as it is often the case in digital poetry, you can technically print the output. That's a separate entity, but you will still need to understand how that program works in order to interpret the work in a competent and wholesome way. Otherwise, again, it just seems like rambling or a meaningless experiment. So the computer is essential to the creation and most of the times to the enjoyment of these different electronic literary works. The other definitions, as you can see, also highlight other aspects that we should not forget about. Many of them mention important literary aspects. Again, Leonardo Flores probably is the clearest in this, and is the one that I also try to follow most of the times, because he specifically mentions written language as the central piece of these works. As I mentioned, there might be sound, visuals, other components involved, and it often happens that these electronic literary works go into, let's say, video game territory or some other playful formats. And for that specific purpose, I usually combine these two definitions at least to highlight that the written word should be, at least for me, it is important. So it should be in the dominant position. And then all the other elements should be just secondary. And again, they add something to the interpretation, but the artistic engagement of written language is what we should highlight first and foremost. All right. So to also talk about how this form developed over time, I will go back to the beginning, actually, to the 50s. So ever since the first computers, there was already an interest in how they could be used to create all kinds of experiments, including the literary ones. So if we go back to, again, the 50s, to Christopher Strachey and his love letter generator, which is based on Alan Turing's random number generator, we can already see the first examples of digital combinatory poetry. This program that Strachey created actually still exists. It's a variation on it. It's not exactly the same, but Nick Montfort recreated it. If you want to look it up, you can by or under this name, Love Letters. Again, the original was created in '53. This is a recreation of that you can see on the slide in this image. Practically very simple experiments like this were common. In this case, you can see a kind of algorithmic poem. So there is a certain structure into which words are inserted randomly. There are different categories of words in the program. So for instance, the invocation is always similar. So honey duck or dear love, for example, it addresses that other person, the love in this case. And then you have an assortment of sentences that sound perhaps a little bit romantic, a little bit seductive. They don't always make sense because, again, it's a random combination of words. But sometimes you get very nice love letters out of these combinations. So this was just a fun experiment that they tried, and they just posted the output. They created one of these every day, and for a certain amount of time, they just posted it on the door at the university where Strachey and Turing were working, for instance. And these were the kinds of experiments that inspired others to create, again, story generators, even chatbots. The first one is very famous, Eliza, as being a convincing kind of therapist, a digital therapist. And from that, we move on to the more serious experiments in the 80s, 90s, and the perhaps most complicated forms of electronic literature today. So from the very beginning, we have these examples that we can investigate and try to, again, contextualize e-literature in. Okay, so what are the features of electronic literature then, as opposed to print literature? Some of these, as you will see, can be printed. For instance, no one can deny that print literature is interactive, or that it can be multilinear, multimodal, it can include pictures and so on. Collaboration also is quite common when creating some, and let's say a comic book or similar forms. But in electronic literature, they are even more amplified. So, and there are different types of interactivity or multilinearity that we can create in digital devices. So by interactivity here, I mean, first and foremost, some kind of direct participation. Let's say you are a character in a story, you are involved directly, you can create some kind of background for yourself, or just have a blank slate that you can identify with. You are addressed in those cases in the second person narration, and perhaps you can even make some direct impact on the story world. So you can make choices that, let's say, lead to different outcomes, different endings within the story, choices that can lead to the redemption of some of the characters or the condemnation of others, even the death in some cases. So these are the kinds of things that you cannot really do in literature. It would take an immense amount of effort, lots of flipping between pages, and in digital programs, it can be done seamlessly, and you can enjoy it, and the immersion is not broken like it would be in print if you again have to shuffle around the book a lot. So there are many other types of interactivity that can be done in electronic literature. Again, most of them are specific to these digital media, so they cannot really be recreated in print. Multilinearity is tied to interactivity. Usually when you give users, readers, a choice, and you have multiple pathways with various endings, that's what we call multilinearity. So the more freedom is given, the more pathways through the narrative there will be. There is a constant battle in electronic literature between giving readers a choice and allowing these different pathways, or more like random stories that they can generate through their interaction with the work. But again, there is that constant battle between narrative coherence and the freedom of choice in digital narratives. So the more freedom is given, usually there is less coherence. And if we want to maintain narrative coherence, probably the right way somewhere in the middle, so that there is some choice, but everything is, again, predefined, and all of the outcomes are accounted for. There is nothing surprising, at least to the author, when it comes to the different pathways. Multimodality here means a combination of semiotic modes. Other than text, we usually have audio, video, still images incorporated into these works. Not in all genres, but it's very typical to use these different media formats, or modalities, I should say, because I kind of separated multimodality and multimediality. They are related terms, often used synonymously, but for the purposes of highlighting different features, I kind of separated them here. So multimodality just means the incorporation of different modes of communication, like text, audio, video. Multimediality for me means the ability to present a fictional work in multiple various medias or mediums, and sometimes multiple of these are used at once. By that I mean, for instance, if you have a more experimental work, like an art installation, where you have to go into a specific room, let's say, and you have a projector, a computer, maybe a headset or some peripheral devices, all of those combined, or some of them at least, would represent different media formats, and together they constitute that electronic literary work. It's very experimental, not done on a large scale, but there are some instances where this happened. Or, as I mentioned the poems before, some of them can be enjoyed in print and digital versions as well, with some caveats to it. And there is an increased collaboration in electronic literature between different artists. Obviously, it's not really possible to ask, let's say, a writer to be proficient in every single aspect that, let's say, an electronic literary work involves. For instance, there is the issue of digital literacy. Some people might need the help of programmers. Some people, if they want to include, again, video, different kinds of illustrations, somebody else is usually responsible for creating those, as well as the different audio formats. It is not impossible, of course, to create something like this alone, but usually for that reason, these works are very short and focused mostly on the experimental aspect. So sometimes the narrative component struggles because of that, because they focus more on trying to put it all together, but yeah, it's a complicated endeavor. And the last kind of, let's say, characteristic that I often reference is cybertextuality, which is in essence similar to what I've already mentioned. There is some difference between the different characteristics that I list here and the other ones I mentioned before, but you will see some overlaps as well. So cybertextuality for me means a combination of different things. For instance, the controlled or limited access to the text that the author can evoke. When you have a physical book in your hand, you can manipulate it in any way. You can open it on any page, you can go to chapters in advance, you can go back to previous chapters. In electronic literature, that's not always the case. So the access that you have to the work is tightly controlled. If you, for instance, advance from one part of the narrative to another, that previous part might be locked or entirely deleted. So you cannot access it until you open that work again and go through it again. Again, the chapters that might be coming up or the sections that might be coming up might be locked from you. You cannot see anything in advance. And sometimes there is text that you never actually get access to. Even if we just think about the coding aspect, the source code, how that work actually functions. Sometimes you have access to it, sometimes it is hidden and you just have to guess how it operates, how that work operates. So that would be controlled or limited access. These texts, electronic texts, are for this reason mobile, variable, and transient. That's connected to that controlled aspect. So we have lots of moving parts, some of which you will see, some of which will be hidden. And the text, it might even happen that the text that you get in one specific reading, you will never have access to again. If you have a poetry generator or a random story generator, if you generate some for yourself, you read through those. Once you close the program, you lose those. You will no longer have access to it unless you take a screenshot or use a recording device, for instance. And cybertextuality also means that you as a reader have multiple roles to fulfill. Again, the explorative, let's say the traditional one is interpretive, which we all do in all kinds of texts. There is the explorative in addition to the interpretive in digital fiction or electronic literature. That just means you have to, again, find the different pieces, go through different narrative paths, understand how it works, and so on. It's tied to the configurative function, where you have to, for example, choose between choices A, B, and C, or what you will want to access next. And the textonic function is related to how your choices lead to different pieces of text being displayed at any one moment. It's complicated. Hopefully it's a little bit understandable what I'm trying to get at, and the differences overall between electronic literature and print literature, I think, are clearly highlighted. So let's get to some genres, and this is the point where you will also get some video as well. I will probably have to go back to my presentation. So hypertext fiction is one of the earliest genres. It's one of the basic forms. Nowadays, not that, or let's say it's still one of the dominant genres, but not in the form that you can see, for instance, in this video. So in their essence, they are very similar to any kind of website, but especially if you think about Wikipedia, that's a good illustration of what or how these different hypertext fictions functioned in the past. Usually you get a page of text, like the one that you can see here right now in the video. Sometimes there are hyperlinks directly inserted in the text, so some words might be highlighted or, again, presented in blue color or in any other way highlighted to you, so that you know that if you click on these or hover over these, you will go to other pages. And again, each page is a different text. In technical terms, they are called lexias. Each of them presents a different piece of text, contains maybe additional hyperlinks that then lead to other pages, and so on. So often it happens that this is more like a web that you kind of try to piece together, so you can access the pieces of the narrative in any order you wish to, and your task is really not just reading but also reconstructing the narrative. It's like, let's say you had a number of chapters in short chapters in a physical book, but you can reshuffle them in any order. And again, the narrative in that case is not clear immediately. You have to do a little bit of reconstruction to get how the pieces fit together and what it all means. This work that you've seen in this video and that you can see right now is called Patchwork Girl by Shelley Jackson. You can see that it's from 1995, so it's a very old work, which is also visible in the structure that is highlighted in the video. Something like this is not very common today. You can see that it's a different kind of take on hypertext fiction, which includes colors, sometimes images. So it doesn't have to always be just text. And in this case, if you click on all of these different windows, you open a different piece of text. So it's all, probably I will talk about this a bit later, because the work itself is interesting, but for hypertext fiction, to understand what it is, I think that would be enough. Along with hypertext fiction, the other major and basic genre within electronic literature is the interactive fiction or text adventure. These are entirely text-based works, so there is nothing else, just text. And your role is a little bit different. You are not clicking on links. You are supposed to write a little bit. So insert textual commands into the parser, and then that parser interprets what you want to say or do within that fictional world, and based on that, a new piece of text will appear on your screen. You can see it in the video as well. For instance, I typed in look at some item or take an item, and then the program responds whether, for example, first of all, whether it's possible or not, whether it actually understands what you mean or not. So after that, you get a new piece of text, and practically that's how you continue through the narrative. I like the idea that Nick Montfort highlighted, likening interactive fiction to a riddle, because it is very similar. A riddle, for instance, has its own internal logic that you first have to understand to be able to solve it. Each riddle is different in that way. Each has its own internal logic. And it is complicated so that it's not easily, let's say, within a matter of seconds solvable, but it's not impossible to solve. And an interactive fiction is exactly like that. You have to play around with it a little bit to understand what you can and cannot do within that specific work, because again, it was programmed by a human being, so there are certain possibilities that the interactive fiction includes and accounts for, and others that you will try but will result in little difference or probably even some error code as well. Since you are interacting directly with this program, usually you are positioned as a character within that story world and addressed in the second person narration. Just like, again, riddles, it is also replete with puzzles, quests that you need to solve. So it's a very playful genre, and usually the quests and the puzzles take center stage instead of the narrative. There are instances like the one that you can see on the screen, Whom the Telling Changed, which is a complex retelling of parts of the Epic of Gilgamesh inserted into frame narrative, and it is an actually interesting, engaging piece that I would consider well written. So far, again, we covered hypertext fiction and interactive fiction. These are the two oldest forms of electronic literature, and the ones that are the most researched, even though they are not that frequently practiced today. So it's mostly something from the past. Nowadays, we have different updated versions of these genres. Twine fiction would be that update. So twine fiction actually is named after the platform on which these fictions are created. You can see an example in the video again. It's an open source storytelling platform. I actually recommend it to all of you who want to practice maybe some creative writing. Try your hands at digital fiction. It's a very easy to use platform. You just practically writing pieces of text, connecting it through links, as you can see here. And if you want to include additional modalities, again, audio, video, you can do all that. But at the very basic form, it's just text that is very similar to hypertext fiction in that you have those different screens of text. And also similar to interactive fiction, because the text is usually structured like this separate fictional story world, or I don't even know how to call it really, but it's like a pocket world, let's call it that. And you can then not just interact with the different pieces of text and reconstruct the narrative, but as you can see here where I stopped the video, you can make similar choices to what you would do in an interactive fiction. Like you look at certain items, you can investigate or talk to different characters. The difference is that instead of you typing in those commands, they are pre-programmed. So everything just appears on the screen in any color that you want, and then your readers can just choose which path they want to take next, or which action they want to take next. The advantage of this platform is that it's a highly flexible one. You can combine it with coding. If you have some coding experience, you can do much more with it, but at the very basic form, you can still do a lot and just create more traditional or simpler hypertext or interactive fiction. So it's very similar to all those others that I've just shown you. So Twine nowadays is the most popular form. We also have electronic poetry, and within that genre we have a vast amount of different forms. So I would say that e-poetry as such is mostly an umbrella term. The forms include, for instance, generative poetry, multimedia poetry, like the one that you can see here in this video, code poetry, and interactive poetry, which I will also show you a little bit later. This one, for instance, is called Faith by Robert Kendall. And as you can see, instead of just simple text organized into stanzas with some kind of rhyme scheme or meters, you have a poem that moves around, that has different colors, animations that mimic some of the actions that the text describes, which is called kinepoeia. So you can do different digitally specific poetic, or use different digitally specific poetic devices as well. And all of this together is actually what is needed for us to interpret the thing. The animation, the colors, the music that is actually also in this work is important to how we get to that final refined interpretation. So the music you cannot hear right now, but again, there is some in this poem. This one that I have on this slide is a specific form of e-poetry, which many call code work or code poetry. There are, again, variations on this theme. The ones that you see here are print poems, but you can see that they are structured just like a source code of a program would be. And it often happens that writers who do this actually hide some poetry already in the source code. So you can see in these that the words are not just random and not specifically just programming language. So this kind of format gives you a poem on its own. And it often happens that if you run the code, it will give you another poem, a separate piece, which again is a complete poem that we can interpret. And often the two work together. So maybe the source code will show you one side of the argument, and if you run that program, you just get a clear text, and that would be another side to that argument. So there are various experiments that you can do. Generally speaking, if a poem looks like coding language, any type, then that's what we call code work, even if it doesn't work as code itself. Even if it's just in print, it still needs, or that specific structure, that coding language that is used probably contributes in some way to how we see this poem, how we interpret it. Social media fiction is another popular genre. And again, it can be many things. In the past, it's used to be called Twitter fiction or Facebook fiction. For obvious reasons, nowadays, probably it's better to just refer to it by this general term, social media fiction. You can actually do lots of interesting experiments with social media platforms. Other than just posting your own things on social media, I mean specifically engaging with poetry writing bots. On Twitter, these were very popular. I'm not sure how it is nowadays. Practically, their role was to just go through different tweets on Twitter and pick and choose phrases, words from various tweets from various people around the world and construct poems from that. So again, it's very algorithmic. It doesn't always produce interesting results, but sometimes the experiment paid off, and often the best of these creations were published in a print book. So you can find some of those as well on the market. Another one that is that perhaps you can also try is dramatic performances of literary works. The one I have on this slide is a dramatic performance of the Wandering Rocks episode of Ulysses. It was called Bloomsday on Twitter, and the experiment was very, well, it seems simple, of course, to set it up. It was complicated, but the authors, the creators of this project, they created pages or accounts for all of the characters in that episode and set up tweets to be sent out, to be released in a specific order by all of these different characters. So they are reflecting, for example, on their experiences, on whatever is happening with these people in that episode of the novel. What's interesting in this case would be that there is, if you think about tweets or Twitter in general, or X, whatever you want to call it, it is very much a platform that is aligned to stream of consciousness. So most people will put out anything that comes to mind in any order. It doesn't have to be a specific structure behind their Twitter feed or X feed. And practically, that's also what happens in the novel, that there is this stream of consciousness narrative. And now we use this digital platform to show that it also works here, that it's an updated digital version of that same technique that has been used in literature in many different forms. So all of these, again, characters have different accounts. They are still available. So those tweets are still there. This is a photo that I took recently of one of those accounts. And they interact with each other. They like each other's posts or dislike or comment on it, and practically emulate the same kinds of relationships we see in the literary work, in the print literary work. An interesting experiment, or let's say a more hypothetical form that I want to mention, is locative narratives. I wanted to include this because it's something that I find very fascinating, but it is very difficult to achieve. This one is actually a work that only reveals itself to you if you visit specific locations, real life locations in the world. Let's say you have a program or an app that you need to download, and only if you go to specific locations and turn on your GPS, you will be given new pieces of text. So usually it's about that location. So the setting is the centerpiece of these narratives. And whatever you see in front of you in that moment, probably that's what the text is going to be about. So it encourages you to explore an area in a different way, in an interactive and also literary way. There are not many that have been done, obviously, because again, there is a niche market for it. You have to be there to be able to experience it. This one, for instance, is tied to Los Angeles. So if you were to go there, visit those places, you would understand the narrative and get some history about the different locations, maybe again a fictional narrative tied to all those locations, so that you are immersed in the narrative, in that in the lives of those people about whom the narrative is. And lastly, I will mention augmented reality and virtual reality. The one that you see in the video is augmented reality. So you can combine print literature or print books with digital technologies in this way as well. Augmented reality is when you use your camera or phone to scan the pages, and perhaps through your camera some extra text will appear. As you can see in this instance, you only have codes in the print book, and then the text really only appears to you when you turn your camera and turn your book towards the camera. The same can be done with phones. There are different comic books, for instance, that you can just use your digital device over, and then on the digital device you see that the same panels or an animated version of the same panels. Practically the possibilities are limitless. And virtual reality can, of course, only be enjoyed by those who have some kind of head-mounted display, and it's not frequently used for, again, various reasons. It's difficult to implement it, and again, not many people would be able to enjoy it. But I, for instance, read a poem that you can practically, the poem is like the different stanzas are located in this virtual space. You have to navigate, you have to go around, move around a little bit to find the different pieces, and they might be tied to specific images, locations again, or again, possibilities are limitless as long as you have the imagination for it. So yes, this would be AR fiction or VR fiction in general. While I take a bit of a break, I will also show you some further examples of what digital literature can be. Again, there is sound in this one, which you cannot hear. This is, for instance, a kind of gamified version of 80 Days from the World. There are others. This is the Whom the Telling Changed that I've shown you before, the poem again, or you can have this kind of digital comic strip. You see that you have text there. Sorry, I will go back to it. And this kind of 3D effect that is given to the visuals that are in the background. Prose poems that are introduced in the forms of stars. This is a very interesting experiment, in my opinion, where the narrative is about telling stories under the stars, and when you actually hover over all of those, then you get different pieces of the story, different pieces of the prose poem. Storyland is just a story generator, so it's a very random, playful thing. You get a different piece every time, and this is an example of what I mentioned before. If you close this, this will be lost. No, it will be impossible to recreate the same piece. And of course, there are examples that are specifically created for children. The monster at the end of this book is a piece of literature that exists as just a purely print book, and also a digital version where you can interact, engage with the characters, and there are different interactive elements that children can enjoy in addition to just the textual element. So that would be it for this. In case you are interested in finding other further specific examples, I recommend going to the Electronic Literature Organization's website. They have 4 different collections now. The 4th one was released a couple of years ago. They're still collecting. And if you actually have something like this that you would like to highlight, they are also asking every single year for new editions, so you can submit your own work. There are works from different countries in different languages. It doesn't have to be written in English, so anything that involves some kind of experiments with digital devices, different applications, they collect and index in a way that you can easily access them. And if you are interested in it, again, you can research it and enjoy it just for pleasure as well. All right. So I'm not sure how much time we have left, so I will probably ask if anyone could update me on the time. Even though I started with just researching electronic literature and trying to understand how it works and why people might be encouraged or discouraged to enjoy it. For instance, again, there is the issue of digital literacy or dissemination. There's no publishing houses to help you with something like this. And you might be discouraged just because it involves a high level of collaboration with other people. It remains this niche kind of thing, but I also wanted to understand how this form interacts with digital literature, print literature. So specifically, for instance, I highlighted 4 categories: medial translation, remediation, media combination, and transmedia storytelling. These are different forms that the 2 domains interact. So for instance, medial translation is very similar to a traditional adaptation. I kind of transformed the concept a little bit so that it's not adaptation in the sense that you can just represent it in a different medium in any different way, but I wanted to focus on the narrative content and the textuality, or the written component being still intact. So in my mind, a medial translation is first and foremost when you move the narrative, the story content of one piece of work from one medium to another. So for instance, if you use a print literary work and restructure it as an electronic literary work, or vice versa as well. And in my mind, again, it should both be still very much focused on the written text. So the print literature is, of course, they're focusing on the written element mostly, but I also wanted to focus, or I also want the electronic version to focus on the written language. I also introduced 3 different modes of this after Linda Kayer's different modes of film translation. So I named these literal, traditional, and radical medial translation. Practically, they are based on how faithful you remain to the source material. So whether you introduce any changes to the narrative itself. But another additional and important element in this case is that some of those translations will engage with the digital medium, with different affordances of digital media to a higher degree. So that would be radical medial translations. And then some of them will try to just use some basic affordances so that it's not the same as the print version, but not in a way that it will interfere with the narrative or that it becomes overly important to the interpretation of the narrative. The Wasteland from T.S. Eliot would be a great example of a literal medial translation. You have a print poem, a quite complicated one filled with footnotes, and the digital version presents the same exact poem with the same exact footnotes, but you have in that application additional elements like the manuscript that you've just seen, like some video essays or audio recordings. The first audio recording, for instance, is by the author himself. Then there are some additional ones by famous actors and the video essays by academics. So all of these are extra elements that you don't need to engage with, but if you do, you will find additional pieces that will contribute to your interpretation. So that's what I mean mostly by literal medial translation. When the core, the original remains intact, but additional elements are introduced to perhaps help you enhance your interpretation if you want to engage with it, but it's not necessary to do that. It's also an interesting fact that the digital version restores Eliot's original vision of the poem. He actually, again, it's a very long poem and includes a long list of footnotes that you can read and you need to read to understand the nuances, the different shifts in tone, perspective, and so on. And Eliot just originally wanted to publish that poem without any outside help. The only reason, as far as I know, that he wrote the footnotes, which are now an important part of the interpretation, is because he needed to fill some additional pages to publish it as a print booklet. Otherwise, it would have been impossible because they needed to have a certain amount for the publisher to be able to do that, or maybe for it to be profitable. So he wrote the footnotes, but he was never really happy with them. And in most versions that we have in print, those are there. In this version, in the digital one, they are entirely hidden. So you don't need to engage with the footnotes. You have the option to look at them, but again, it's just an additional element. It's not tied to the, practically the only way to access them is if you click on certain expressions or tap certain expressions in this narrative. So I find it a good, faithful adaptation or translation, also for that reason that it restores that original vision that the author had in mind. Then there are, let's say, traditional medial translations. Whom the Telling Changed, the story I've shown you before, would be one example of that. Again, it embeds a part of the Epic of Gilgamesh in the middle of a frame narrative. So that's why it's not a literal medial translation. It's not exactly, again, the same as the source. There are certain changes made. We have the source material that is replete with omissions, things that we don't have access to, because those tablets that they came on are damaged. So some parts might be left out, and we can only rely on our interpretation or inferences to fill in the blanks. So the digital version actually fills in the blanks according to the author's interpretation. But what makes it a good, again, translation, traditional translation, is that the core purpose of the text is preserved. It is often highlighted that the original epic is meant to educate audiences, readers. It was, again, transmitted as an oral story for a long time, and the main purpose was to derive some kinds of lessons from the stories that are included in it. And the digital version emphasizes that that aspect to a higher degree, because in this interactive fiction, you are also given different questions, different choices at certain points in the narrative, and you have to demonstrate whether you've learned anything from the epic or not. The narrative is practically just a tribe gathering around the campfire, and they are talking, they are discussing the Epic of Gilgamesh and trying to understand it, interpret it together, practice critical thinking. And that's why you are given those choices in between different scenes. And you can then lead your tribe to peace or to war. You can find different endings. There's numerous combinations, positive and negative. So it's all based on your interpretation of the epic and whether you technically understood the lessons that it's trying to convey or not. So since that central aspect is preserved and the themes are very much the same, to start with, they are universal, so it's the same as the epic. I consider it to be a traditional medial translation. And then the radical ones look like this. So this one is, again, a poem, a kind of flesh poem that adapts a part of Ulysses. Oh, sorry, not Ulysses, but actually the Odyssey. So partially based on Ezra Pound's cantos, which are based on the Odyssey. That's probably a better phrasing. But as you can see, it's very difficult to follow. It's a completely radical reimagining of that original text. Here, for instance, we have, instead of Odysseus going to the underworld, we have a cross-country road trip. Some of the characters have modern interpretations, like, for example, Elvis plays the role of Tiresias. So all of those different pieces are still there, the characters, the basic plot points, but they are updated to this modern American context of this road trip. And all of this is presented not as a traditional narrative piece, but as a flash poem that is very difficult to follow. One of the things, again, that you cannot hear right now is the music in the background. So every single screen of text is tied to that jazz music that accompanies the piece. That's why it's going so fast. And whether we like it or not, even these movements, the flashes that you've just seen, the music, the font, the way the different words are presented are important to the interpretation. So it's a very complicated procedure. I remember one researcher who, Jessica Pressman actually, who just printed out all of these different frames individually and then analyzed it that way. So again, it takes a lot of effort to engage with something like this in an academic manner. So these would be radical media translations. Again, the difference is just how much change the narrative. That's also a basic criteria of traditional translation or adaptation. And then my edit criterion is how much of that medium, that new medium that we put that story in, that narrative in, engages with the unique affordances of that medium. So if there is less interaction, it's a more literal or traditional medial translation. If there is more interaction with the unique capabilities of the medium, then it's a radical medial translation. And another form would be remediation. Just briefly, I will go through this so that we can also have a discussion. When you see print books, let's say, that incorporate some kind of visual, sorry, not visual, but digital elements, for instance, a visit from the Goon Squad has PowerPoint slides in one of the chapters, that's what we call remediation. Remediation is just when you try to imitate another medium in your home medium or native medium. So that other one is not present, like PowerPoint obviously is not in the print book, but you evoke the associations that you have with PowerPoint through the inclusion of these PowerPoint slides. So that whole chapter, which is supposed to be a young girl's diary in this novel, is presented in, I think, 76 different slides. Each of them is a different form of organization. So obviously, one of the things we use PowerPoint for is to organize information in a coherent, nice, pleasurable way. And the same kinds of effects are evoked through how the girls' thoughts are organized in different PowerPoint slides. There is a digital version of that as well, which is full color. The print is mostly presented in black and white, so the colors are sometimes missing. And that's one of the things that remediation is, again. It's just an imitation. It's never going to be the same. You cannot obviously use all of the capabilities of PowerPoint, but you can at least call on those associations that you have with the program when you are analyzing that specific chapter. It can happen in the other way as well. So the digital literature can also imitate print books, the format, the layout. page numbers, for instance, if you have that in a digital piece of fiction, it's very uncommon to do it, so that would be a remediation of print practices. You also have media combinations when both media are simultaneously present in a single literary work. So you use different systems, 2 different systems at least, and both of them are actually present, not just simulated. I have an example like this, Ascension by Steve Thomas Ewan. Here you can see a print book, right? So one side is text. The other is QR codes to different videos. And practically what you need to do, you don't have to do it, but what you should do while you're reading this narrative is engage with these additional elements. So while you're reading about, let's say here, a mother is recalling how she lost her child during a tsunami, and on the other side you have different videos that lead to a kind of actual visual representation of what the ramifications of a tsunami are. So you can see that in some ways it enhances your, even if not the interpretation, but at least the emotional connection to that piece. It's a much more vivid description through that video of the same scene of what happened to this person in the novel. There are obvious complications. Sometimes, again, these videos are inaccessible. Probably it's the not well practiced form because it involves these risks that if you publish something like this, it will be intact for a couple years, but as soon as those videos disappear or the QR codes expire, no one can access those videos anymore. But it's an interesting experiment, at least, to have something like this. Between page and screen is the same. I've shown you this problem before. It's the same concept. You have 2 different medial systems combined into one. Both have to be present for you to enjoy the work. The print book, as you can see, is just these codes similar to QR codes or markers. And from that, you cannot really get any of the narrative. So you have to engage with the digital device to get the narrative. Both are required. It's impossible to access it with just one of the components. And then the last form, again, just very briefly, is transmedia storytelling, is another way how print and digital literature interact. By this, again, we just mean when a narrative is continued or, let's say, disseminated in different medial systems, so in multiple entries in multiple media. And an illustrative example, this one will be the last one, is Black Box by Jennifer Egan, the same author who wrote A Visit from the Goon Squad with those PowerPoint slides. She also wrote an additional chapter to that book just as Twitter fiction. So that is now also published in print, but when it appeared, it was transmedia storytelling in its purest form. So you had the print book with chapters, and then you had an additional chapter that was just a digital literary work. It's all set in the same universe. That's why we have this term transmedia storytelling. All of them contribute to the same story world, but presented in different forms, in mutually exclusive forms, usually. So that's when transmedia storytelling is the strongest. And that would be it. So I tried to just explain the basics without hopefully complicating anything. So now we can get to some questions and answers. So if you have anything, try to engage with me, either through the chat or directly.
Thank you, Eric. We are getting our camera on. In between, there was a power issue, but that was really very, very new for many of us. In fact, there would be quite a few things to ask to you. For example, and they might sound like very basic. For example, you mentioned at the very beginning about Virginia Woolf, and then you remembered how in her own time she was talking about the changes in narrative. And then you went through and gave us the information about the Routledge and Companion for what is it, the experimental literature. And so, like if I recollect, when Virginia Woolf was talking about something very fundamental as reality of life as a shower of atoms, for example, or life being something like a luminous halo. In this encyclopedia, discussing about various kinds of virtual reality or digital reality, is there any idea what is reality defined as?
In that companion, not really.
So how do we see in this? I mean, because it would be, I would also be connecting it to we cannot arrive then at any kind of a, between one reader and the other, if they interact with this digital way of storytelling, and between the readers there are prompts that changes the narrative. So we cannot actually arrive at one interpretation between the readers also, isn't it?
In most cases, yes, that's the case. It's very difficult to, with the most experimental ones, of course. There are traditional narratives as well, which are roughly the same for each of those interactors or readers. But since this is a more or less experimental field, most of those works will be like that, what you've just mentioned, that everyone who interacts with it will get something different, and it would be very difficult to arrive, yes, the same kind of content, the same kind of interpretation, and so on.
Yeah, because in between we were also, when you mentioned about the wasteland, for example, that is, I take your response as a response that we all have, students of literature have, somewhere there is a feeling of going to the original, when you mentioned that what you liked about that version of the wasteland is that you have a feel of the original. There is actually a very, very hazy idea of anything called the original here, isn't it?
It's not really as much the original as the original vision. So it's more like a reconstruction of what the author himself expressed many times his wish to be. So it was, yes, nowadays the poem itself and the footnotes are inseparable, but from the historical documents, from interviews, we know that he expressed that wish to just delete them, to just eliminate them, because he didn't really want to influence readers in any kind of way to give them the answer key practically, and the footnotes are that. So it's just that vision that the digital version recreates, not as any kind of original poem or in that sense.
Yeah, of course. I mean, had Eliot not given his manuscript to Ezra Pound, and it wouldn't have been scissored down to almost one third, then it would have been a book length, of course. That is another story altogether.
Yes.
Yeah. But I mean, if there are others, even your students from that side, if there are people who want to interact or ask questions, the floor is open. The wall is open. The digital wall is open for interaction. What would be the problems of teaching such texts, Eric? Are you personally teaching it, or is it right now part of your research or postdoc research?
Occasionally, I experiment with some kinds of activities around digital literature. Some of the people suffered that experiment very recently, who are here online today. So I try to, but I mostly choose something that is very simple, that even the narrative is simple, the experiment is simple to understand. So I wouldn't really include any of the complicated ones, I would say. But for instance, interactive fiction, which is purely text-based, twine fiction, which is also mostly text-based and more or less has one way to go through it or leads to the same kind of outcomes, same kinds of interpretations. That's a little bit easier to tackle, and it's actually a well-established practice, at least in American universities, that they have creative writing courses structured around interactive fiction or interpretation structured around those kinds of works. Nothing of the more experimental one. That would be, I'm not sure I would be brave enough, yes, to tackle those.
And also it would require the more experimental ones, hopping over across media would require more resources.
Yes. Right, yes. So that's another thing, yes. So anything that we can access on a mobile phone or a notebook, that's practically where I draw the line.
Correct, yeah. Any of the students there at Nitra want to ask anything? Yeah, there is a question from here. Please, be loud.
Thank you for such an interesting session. First of all, when I was going through neo-avant-garde movement, or we can say neo-avant-garde literature, I came to know about Fluxus, and today also you have mentioned in the beginning Fluxus movement. So I was very curious at that time and even today. So my question is, with Fluxus emphasis on performance and ephemerality, how can its principle inform the way we read or interpret literature in an age of rapid digital consumption?
Okay, so I've heard parts of the question. I've heard the fluxus, right? So questions about that, but maybe if you could repeat it, it was very difficult to understand the second half.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wasn't audible.
Okay, so my question is, with Fluxus emphasis on performance and ephemerality, how can its principles inform the way we read and interpret literature in an age of rapid digital consumption?
So as far as okay, let's start with the Fluxus movement. Some of the, let's say, overlaps with electronic literature would be, yes, that performative aspects. There is at least one that I know about, one of those Fluxus works. It's a very like, I would say, art gallery type of engagement of, or with literature. At least that's according to the examples that I've seen. So, it's a very difficult question. I'm sorry, could you repeat the last half? Was it about, so principles?
Yeah, once again, yes.
The principles, sorry.
Yeah, now can I ask a question?
Is it audible that side? Erik, can you hear the voice?
Sorry. Yes, sorry, just my mic for some reason got muted, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
With Fluxus emphasis on performance and ephemerality, how can its principles inform the way we read and interpret literature in an age of rapid digital consumption? It's muted. You are muted. Please unmute yourself.
Eric, please unmute yourself. You're muted.
Yes, someone keeps muting me. I see. Sorry. So, where was I? Again, difficult question, but roughly how I understand it is, if we just compare that movement, for example, the Fluxus movement, to digital literature or electronic literature, and the way we read or interpret these works, there are some overlaps. I heard ephemerality, as you mentioned. So the way I understand reading and interpreting this kind of literature is that, of course, it's very difficult to do because of digital technologies. The very digital technology that allows it to be unique and experimental also kind of hinders our reading process and engagement with them. And by that I mean that it often happens that work is published and 2 or 3 years later it's no longer accessible. So yes, it's a fleeting moment most of the times. It's a rapidly evolving field. As technology moves on, everything that, for example, now we have from the 90s or even the 2000s is very difficult to access on our modern computers. So even when I was trying to access those, read them and interpret them, I had to resort to some special kind of way to access it, some emulations of older versions of Windows or software. So it was difficult mostly for that reason. And practically all I can say to this question is that for me, this is why it's important to engage with digital literature in this moment, while it is still there. It's not going to be something that is, that, let's say, becomes a classic or becomes a part of most of the university curricula around the world. It's going to remain probably a niche kind of field that will develop, continue to develop, but in order to understand it, we have to engage with it in that specific moment. So the collections, for instance, by the Electronic Literature Organization are assembled for that reason. They are trying to archive the older works, so that it's not that fleeting moment, as I've mentioned, so that we can access them at any time, but it's very, very difficult to do it. And another way to answer your question is just, that even if this is not an issue, even if digital technologies are not an issue, then we have that area of multiple interpretations, and not multiple interpretations, but let's say widely different works that you engage with within one single product. And I'm not really sure how, for example, such works could be interpreted in a coherent and competent way. I haven't really seen academics engage with those types of works that really give you like completely different outputs that you can no longer access once you finish the work. So probably we will remain focused more on the clearest examples, the ones that are mostly the same for all of the users, that are stable, not variable, and so on. So that's my assumption, that's the way to engage with these kinds of works. And the experiments will just remain on the sideline, probably.
Thank you.
I think there is one more from here.
Thank you. It was really an enriching session. a lot of novelty. There are two things I want to say. Firstly, I was wondering that the work itself, when we read tangible works, the original
Mm.
text, the work itself is in the center, the text is autotelic. But then when we engage with these texts in a digital landscape, would it again, I was just wondering that would it shift the focus from the text itself to a lot of different aspects, because there are a lot of aspects which we engage with. So will
Mm.
the narrative and text suffer at a higher cost? And secondly, what is the market for this consumption and creation of the hybrid literature, of the digital literature?
So the first question, I think I mentioned it briefly that it will, yes. So the narrative often suffers for that reason. There are cases when it's a careful balancing game. So that there are, ways to prevent that from actually coming true, that you will be distracted by all these other modalities. So that's why I personally focus on those electronic literary works where the text, the written text, is clearly in the central position. And everything else is like if you have a print book with illustrations or a comic book, everything else is there for you to interpret, but not necessarily important to the central narrative. So those are the ones that I try to focus on. But yes, those that you just mentioned also exist, where such a line is difficult to draw, where there is some, let's say, complication in how you will deal with all of this, because everything seems to just overwhelm you. But many times that's the point. It's kind of a way to highlight modern thinking, the modern consciousness. That's practically what everyone is doing on TikTok, Instagram, engaging with all of these rapid stimuli. So some of those literary works deliberately try to recreate that effect, and with varying degrees of success, of course. But yes, in those cases, the narrative suffers. So there has to be some kind of balance for it to work and for it to be engaging for anyone who is interested in traditional print literature. As far as the market goes, or the interest, it is a very niche kind of field. It's international, so there are works from, even on the Electronic Literature Organization's website, from all countries in all different languages, as I mentioned. A small group of works, if we consider the overwhelming number of print literature. It's not something that you can sell. That's one of the things that complicates things. If you want to make money, if you want to be a professional writer, this is not going to be for you. This is really, truly just an experimental form. And it's very difficult to find anyone who would actually, let's say, post it on some website or create digital archives where you can pay these creators and buy this product. So there is no established publishing house or publishing structure behind any of this. This is all just focused on trying something new with literature as a form, on trying to maybe think about what it can be or could be, or how it will be in the future, whether it can survive if we add all of these elements, whether as you pointed out, the text or the textual layer will suffer if we don't find some kind of compromise. So it's more centered around that, and not on promoting it, publishing it in a professional manner and marketing it or capitalizing on it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Erik. If there are no more questions, then we have come to the end of our time. It was really very interesting, very fresh, very new. And for all of us here, as you said very rightly, the line that we will take is that we need to now more and more engage with this type of narrative, because increasingly our real world is also becoming so virtual and so digital. So we need to understand this. That is a big takeaway from this presentation of yours. Thank you very much, Erik. Thanks from all
You're
of us
welcome.
here.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Bye-bye. All the best. Bye.
Goodbye.